The climate always changes. Well, yes, it does. How has the climate changed during human history? How did that change affect people? And what lessons can we take from it for the modern climate change debate? Let's have a look. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. If you're interested in climate change, you should be interested in what history teaches us on that subject. I thought I would dive in, particularly when I got hold of a copy of Climate, History and the Modern World by H. Lamb. The first edition was published in 1982, although it was updated in 1997. Inevitably, I'm going to be cantering through this and focusing on certain parts of the world where we've got some better historical records, a lot more than other parts where we don't. It's to get a flavour, not a definitive tutorial about historical climate. Humankind's history begins at the last ice age, with early men living in caves, painting the world as they knew it, with bisons and mammoths, rhinoceros, horses and deer in a treeless landscape. But I'm not going to trace through all of those earliest periods. Our knowledge of the details is scant, the impact of changes on human populations, mostly conjecture. Obviously, we know that the glaciation came to an end, and the massive ice sheets in various parts of the world melted over a long period of time. Sea levels therefore rose from about 15,000 BC, with the most rapid phases of sea level rise between 8,000 and 5,000 BC, ending with the climate around 3,000 BC being generally warmer by 1 to 3 degrees than it was by the end of the 20th century. As the glaciers retreated, humans could come out of the caves and the cultivation of plants became possible and all of that. So after that really nice cosy initial extended warmth, we got around to the 1st century BC. There were a number of places where the evidence is that things had cooled down considerably. A significant cooling of the Arctic was going on, which left evidence in Canada, Greenland and Scandinavia. Mountain glaciers were advancing in all the regions. And there's also evidence of population movements southwards from northern and central Europe. Even further south, it seemed that the Greeks of early classical times gave some clues because they moved from a style of clothing best described as semi-nudity and living in flat-roofed buildings of the early Mycenaean and Minoan Crete cultures, and switched to warmer clothes and pitched gable roofs. Early historian Livy mentioned at least a few severe winters in Rome, when the river Tiber froze and snow lay for many days. He also mentioned that beech trees grew there around 300 BC. By the time Pliny was writing in the 1st century AD, the beech remained only as a mountain tree. This also came with some fairly vigorous storms in the North Sea. According to the Greek historian Strabo, between 120 and 114 BC, there was a series of storms which pushed back the coast of Denmark and Germany. What he called the Cumbrian flood led to a southward migration of the Celtic and Teutonic peoples who had been living in the areas that were affected. As you might have guessed from the previous comment about beech trees, once we got properly into Roman times, things started to warm up again. In De Re Rustica by Columella, the author noted that although vines and olives had been unprotected from the cold in previous times, now they produced olive crops and vintages in the greatest abundance. And evidence that there was a gradual global warming up to 400 AD was consistent with evidence that there was also a rising sea level at that time. It seems to have amounted to a metre or less, but it was enough to submerge the earlier harbour installations in the Mediterranean. It produced an incursion of the sea from the Wash into the English Fenland, and moreover the previous coastline of Flanders and the Netherlands between about AD 250 and 275, which caused people to have to move from that area. In North Africa and the Near East, it seems as though around this time it was moister than it came later to be. This made extensive croplands possible. In fact, it acted as the granary of the Roman Empire. And there were thriving settlements at places like Petra, which have since been buried by the desert. After AD 400, as the Roman times came to an end, cooler temperatures kicked in. Those changes had a big impact. Around AD 400, wheat, barley, oats, rye and flax were all grown in East Anglia in England, where I live today. But by the 7th century, they had been abandoned. and there's evidence the site had just become too marshy following much wetter years in the 6th century. Wet in East Anglia, but not so much in the Mediterranean, North Africa and far to the east into Asia. Around AD 400 and 800, those areas had periods of severe drought. The Caspian Sea fell to low levels at those times, and in southern Italy and Greece, people were migrating to the coasts to get away from the drought. In Arabia, places where agriculture had been carried on with the help of extensive irrigation, that agriculture was abandoned around AD 600. The rapid spread of Islam apparently took place at a time when there were stresses due to widespread drought. On the other side of the Atlantic, the Mayan civilization tended to be thriving at exactly the times when the Mediterranean was gripped by drought. From AD 300 to 800, it spread from the latitude 14 or 15 to 25 north in Central America. But after AD 800, it declined pretty quickly. A wetter period made it probably too difficult to support a larger population and too difficult to hold back the forest. Then we get to what's been described as the medieval warm period. Things got warmer in Europe, warmer in the Antarctic, but colder in China. Viking raids in the northern areas from the 790s onwards probably became possible because of the retreat of the ice, allowing them to go north into the Arctic and west to Greenland. In Greenland, there were Old Norse burials that took place in grounds that are now completely frozen. Grain was grown in Iceland, as it was in Norway, as far up as 69 degrees north. Tillage in England went up to higher levels above sea level, such as Dartmoor at 400 metres, and in Northumberland to 320 metres. In the 1280s, crops were established so high on the Pennines and Northumbrian moors that sheep farmers are recorded as having complained that too little land was left for grazing sheep. Higher sea levels meant that the island of Ely in England was so cut off that the inhabitants were able to hold out for some years against the Norman conquest of England, longer than the rest of the country. Tree rings in oaks from the lowlands of Germany show extremes, swinging between the narrowest and widest tree rings. These suggested drought between 910 and 930, and again in the 990s. Between 1052 and 1160, widths were a lot wider, suggesting that warmth plus excessive wetness was the order of the day. In North America, east of the Rocky Mountains, there's evidence to suggest that the temperatures followed a similar sequence. In AD 700 onwards, the climate in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains seems to have become wetter than before, the prairie giving way to landscapes with more trees, until it swung back around again in 1200. Farming people spread north, westwards on the plains, thriving until that pivotal point where there started to be drought and consequent changes in vegetation. But in China, the 11th and 12th centuries were much colder, with frequent references to snow and ice in the winters and snows a month later in the spring than in later experience. Plum trees were disappearing from North China, frosts killed the mandarin trees near Shanghai and the lychees in parts of the south. There are signs that this was a cold time generally around the wide expanse of the North Pacific Ocean, which suggests that the course of this period's changes may have come partly from a persistent tilt in the polar vortex, away from the Atlantic and towards the Pacific. Evidence suggests this may have been caused by higher than average solar radiation and a period of reduced volcanic activity. Consequent changes in ocean circulation patterns brought warmer water into the North Atlantic. Arguably, it's because most of our records come from Europe at this time that it's known as the warm period. It seems in fact to have been a shift of zones rather than a global warming. Now, the warm phase passed its peak in Greenland in the 12th century, but it continued mostly in Europe until 1300 or so, but with a big increase in severe storms in the North Sea towards the latter part, with flooding disasters on the low-lying coasts. There were at least 4 massive sea floods of the Dutch and German coasts in the 13th century, with a death toll for each estimated at more than 100,000 people, and in the worst incident, 306,000 people. As a result of the floods of 1240 and 1362, it was reported that 60 parishes, making up over half of the agricultural income from Slesvig in Denmark, had been swallowed by the sea. In England, the great ports of Ravenspur and Dunwich were lost in successive stages in the sea storms. Deaths of 100,000 or more people in floodings of the continental shore of the North Sea were recorded in 1421, 1446 and 1570. The 1570 storm saw great cities flooded and resulted around 400,000 deaths. Overall, the end of the medieval warm period in Europe was one of the most difficult times in human history so far. Former croplands were failing, being abandoned in the north and on the uplands of Europe. As farms and villages were deserted and fields were enclosed for sheep, there were riots and revolts. The people were putting blame for their sufferings on whoever was turning the land to new and more appropriate use. An abandonment of farms began in North Norway before 1200, and there was a drift of the population south and towards the coastal fisheries. Between 1310 and 1320, there were disastrously wet summers and failed harvests in Europe, the worst of which was 1315, where the grains failed to ripen across the whole of Europe. This produced famine. In many places so dire, there were deaths on a wide scale, and even in Western Europe, incidents of cannibalism were reported. The Old Norse Greenlanders around 1200 found that the ice was encroaching on the seas that were used to link up with Iceland and with Europe. In America, the corn that people had been growing for 200 years all across the high plains, from the base of the Rockies to eastern Colorado and western Nebraska, that had to give way around 1200 with the rapid changes in climate. Oak trees disappeared, the overall number of trees declined, and we saw the return of the plants of the prairie. Deer gave way to bison in people's diets, which suggested that rainfall had declined. By 1492, the Little Ice Age was in full swing. The Pope had written of his concern for the people of Greenland because of the extensive freezing of the seas, because it had been pretty much cut off for 80 years by that point, and the old Viking population there duly died out. The formerly thriving vineyards in England began to fail and were eventually abandoned. The winters of 1407-8 and 1422-3 were so severe that traffic became possible across the frozen Baltic Sea. Wolves were reported to have passed over the ice on the easternmost part of the North Sea from Norway to Denmark. Unlike the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age covered the entire Earth. In England, the late 17th century thermometer temperatures were about 0.9 degrees centigrade lower than the 1920 to 1960 period. In the last decade of that century, it was 1.5 degrees centigrade lower. It didn't start badly. The temperatures between 1500 to 1550 were quite moderate, although there were 3 winters where the Thames froze over. But from 1550 for the next 150 years, we saw the coldest period since the glaciation came to an end 10,000 years previously. There were major advances in the glaciers in the Alps, and the Swiss lowlands saw major increases in snow cover, which led to famine conditions as various crops such as wheat and potatoes failed. Sea ice reached Scotland. Cod disappeared from the North Sea around the country around 1615. Cod can't tolerate water below 2 degrees centigrade, so the water temperatures had clearly gone below that level. The snows and frosts got worse from about 1670, with oat harvests failing 7 years out of 8 and huge losses of sheep. Obviously, from between 1800 to 1850, we started to recover from the Little Ice Age. There are lots of details in all of it, but I'm going to leave the timeline there for this video and just come back to the general question. What do we make of all this? Obviously, this has been a quick canter through the timeline, picking out the scantiest details from some of the places that just happen to have the records. But there are some thoughts it leaves me with. First, when people say the climate has always changed, that is obviously true. I must admit, when I started this exercise, I wasn't quite aware of how dramatic some of the short-term shifts in climate had actually been, and the massive effects those changes had had on human populations. Now, of course, when people say the climate has always changed in modern context, they're sometimes using it as an argument for complacency. The suggestion that this is a process we can do nothing about, so we might as well shrug our shoulders and just get on with it. If you look at the history, I don't think you would suggest that it comes across as an argument for complacency. What it is remarkable perspective for the recent period, which has, in contrast, been an incredibly stable and benign stretch of time. People make the assumption that history is all about the actions of human society, performed against the backdrop of a stable climate, rather than people often being forced to react to major challenges presented to them by changes in that climate. For 80 years or more, down to about 1960, the climate was so stable it began to become considered that climate was a constant. And you see it today in the climate change discourse. This started apparently at the 1935 conference of the International Meteorological Organization, when it established the period 1901 to 30 as what it called the climatic normal period. The choice of the word normal created a certain psychological presumption that persisted. We now see that 1901 to 30 was a pretty abnormal period, although it was officially surpassed in any case by 1931 to 60, which became the new normal period. In fact, these were probably the warmest and in a number of regions the wettest periods of such length for several centuries. For a while, everything just seemed to be satisfactory. Nobody much took any interest in climate behaviour. But since about 1950, the climatic tendencies changed. There was a marked global cooling in the 1960s in the Northern Hemisphere, reversing the upward trend which had been the latter stages of exit from the Little Ice Age. This was happening against the backdrop of a surging growth in population, an ever-rising standard of living which began to show signs of straining resources. Some people, incorrectly we now know, started to worry about population outstripping available resources in the short term. It was also a time of the increasing rationalisation of agriculture and world trade, so huge areas of croplands became focused on just one or two crops, which supposedly suited the conditions there the best. But that equation very much depends on the expected continuation of constancy of climate, which even without evidence of human influence, climate change isn't something that seems compatible with the history we've just gone through. So this was why Henry Kissinger, who was US Secretary of State at the time, made a speech at the United Nations in 1974 identifying the threat of climatic changes and urging the scientific community to investigate the problem. And the US at that point took the lead, adopting by Act of Congress in 1978 a National Climate Research Programme and designating 1980 to 2000 as International Climate Decades. The rest that followed, we pretty much know. Many of the non-scientific people who talk about this issue operate from the presumption that climate is naturally stable and all extremes and variations are human-caused aberrations to the status quo. Clearly that's not true. It's also worth noting how big were the factors that affected the changes through history. People look at that 1.2 degrees centigrade that we've warmed since pre-industrial times and they say, that's not a lot. The difference in average temperature between now and the last major ice age, where many places were under glaciers a kilometre high, is just 5 degrees centigrade. Relatively small swings in that overall global average have produced significant variations in what actually happens in certain places. Now, it's worth noting that when you look at the various times the climate had a negative impact on human civilizations, it does seem to be the case that the negatives were stronger during the cooling phases than they were during the warming phases. Generally, when Europe, for instance, was gently warming through Roman times and in medieval times, the consequences had lots of upside. That's true. Let's not forget there were also some substantial signs of drought, and in certain locations that the incidence of drought forced the movement of populations and the abandonment of certain crops. And we're now pushing warmer than the historical record suggests that we have been since there were sizable human populations around to be affected. People on both sides of the climate debate get very excited about arguing exactly, are we or aren't we currently warmer than the medieval warm period? Having reviewed the history, I'm even more of a view that it really doesn't matter. Whether we're past the previous peak or close to it, if the expectation is that we're going to keep going and there's only 5 degrees centigrade of difference between where we are now and the last ice age, then you have to conclude that the additional 1 or 2 degrees that we might put on is likely to have a significant impact. In medieval England, population density was about 20 people per square kilometre. Today, the population density of England is 430 people per square kilometre, and many questions have population densities in the thousands. The ability to support all of those people, the disruption if any one area becomes hostile to life, all of those things have achieved a much bigger scale. Still, for all that the history tells us not to be complacent about the climate, I found this review quite reassuring. Totally subjective response, I know. I do think it makes me even less inclined to spend much time on discussions over specific weather events and whether or not they're caused by us. That's a question that totally sits on that perspective of believing in a stable climate that humans then disrupt. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be taking measured, robust but proportionate action to stop the process of climate change. Where we are today is still pretty much all right, albeit we're going to have to adapt to some changes. And we've certainly seen off any short-term likelihood of hitting another mini ice age, which is a good thing. The extremes on the other side surely increase the further we go, however. So while I think our ability to adapt to change is stronger than it's ever been, there are clearly some real imperatives to taking action to halt the process in good time as well.